introduce Deena Tearney, who sits on the True Board of Advisors. Deena is the founder and CEO of Pacific Point, a Salesforce and Tableau consulting partner headquartered here in Hawaii, with locations in San Francisco, Denver, Sydney, and Singapore. I met Deena when she helped my organization transition to Salesforce a bunch of years ago. Her CRM knowledge, her consulting background helped us develop the solution we needed. And what I valued most was the mind share in rethinking the process and sharing what's possible. And she continues to do this through True, working with organizations, large and small, government agencies, and nonprofits through Pacific Point. We value Deena's expertise and dedication as a member of True and her commitment to Hawaii. And she's also made the 1% Pledge, which supports our youth and inspires them to pursue careers in technology. Welcome, Deena. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very nice. I appreciate the kind words. So thank you very much. And on to today's session. I'm really excited about today. Having data is great. Many organizations have lots of data, but data with action, that's really where the magic is. So we've got some stories today that are going to really inspire you. My name is Deena Tearney. As she said, I'm the founder and CEO of Pacific Point. We're a Salesforce consulting firm headquartered here in Honolulu. Today, I will be the moderator for this amazing set of panelists that we have on the topic of joining the Data Culture Club. I can speak from my own experience and say that many clients come to me and they say, look, we have lots and lots of data, and they're really curious about what that data might tell them. The challenge is that a lot of companies and organizations haven't figured out that fine art and tech. There's a little bit of hard skills, soft skills required to really harness that data to drive action within your organizations, to improve your organizations, to plan them, and to move into the next levels. So and also to distribute that information and that data to everyone in their companies to provide further empowerment within your organization. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We have a top-notch lineup, and they are going to share with us how to join the Data Culture Club. They'll give us some practical use cases and implementations that I think all of us can benefit from. As Michelle said, we are reserving about 10 minutes or so at the end of today's session to ask questions. So begin thinking about what questions you have and how you might want to drive change in your organization in this as you prepare for that portion. All right, so on to the panel. Today we have Nick Redding. He is the Executive Director of the Hawaii Data Collaborative. And with Nick's leadership, the Hawaii Data Collaborative is doing some amazing things, bringing people together using data to solve Hawaii's pressing problems. We also have Erin Huey, the Director of the Pacific Disaster Center's Global Operations, as she joins us today. She really is a true data culture champion within her organization, and she's also on Tableau's COVID-19 Advisory Board. And I'm looking forward to hearing her really interesting use cases. Jeremy Blaney is also joining us today from Tableau. Jeremy is a customer success leader, and he helps Tableau customers see and understand data, and he helps them become more data driven. So I think he's going to have some pretty good tips to share for all of us today. All right, so let's jump right in. First, let's meet the panelists. And for each of you, if you want to go ahead and turn on your camera so we can see your faces. What I'd really like is a little bit of context. We're going to talk about a lot of things, but if you can, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your organization, and that will provide some context as we get into the next set of questions. So with that, how about we do ladies first? Erin.
Aloha, and thank you for having me. So I'm Dr. Erin Huey. As Deena mentioned, I'm the Director of Global Operations for the Pacific Disaster Center. And many times we get confused by our name because we are in the Pacific, we are based here in Hawaii, but we have a global mission. And I think the pandemic that we've all been facing has shown the need to be able to operate remotely with the best data possible to make some of these really challenging decisions. So the Pacific Disaster Center is really designed to bring the best data and information to hazards happening around the world, not just COVID-19, but also the earthquakes, the tsunamis, so people can take quick action. And the only way to make sure that that happens is if you've got the best data that can quickly be mobilized to really lead people to insight and lead not only individuals, but organizations, states. We work very heavily with the US military to get to that decision point with solid information. So we knew that this was an issue. Data, managing data, it's something that we do all the time, but I think COVID put a lens on it and led us even more down the path of integrating Tableau into our work stream to solve a variety of problems. And I think the first and foremost that we'll get the opportunity to talk to today is the time to insight. How do we take credible data and, as you mentioned, mix that art and science to improve decision making? So I'm very excited to be here today and appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. All right, let's go to Nick.
Thanks so much, Deena. Good morning, everybody. So great to be here with you all. As Deena said, I'm Nick Redding, the Executive Director of the Hawaii Data Collaborative. We're a local nonprofit that engages in partnerships to make meaning from data for addressing Hawaii's pressing challenges. We act on the belief that access to timely quality data is fundamental for guiding the decisions that shape how we move forward as a state. I'm going to unpack actually a little bit later in the talk just kind of how we got to where we are today, which will give a sense of our purpose. But what I want to say right away is just that I'm so excited that the concept of data culture is being discussed in this way, because that's actually a term we've been using internally for a few years now. So to have a kind of a public discussion about this and what it means for Hawaii, what it means for our organizations is really exciting to us.
Very cool. Thank you, Nick. All right, Jeremy.
Aloha, everybody, and thanks for having me. By way of introductions, my name is Jeremy Blaney, and I wear a couple of different hats at Tableau. On the one hand, I lead a team of customer success managers that support our clients across the federal government space in the United States and Canada. They have one simple mission, and that is to help people see and understand data and help organizations become more data-driven. And that takes a couple of different shapes and forms depending on who we're talking to, who we're working with, and where they are in their data journey. Though that's my day job, over the course of the past, 8 or 9 months or so, I've really been focusing on something else, and that's Tableau's and Salesforce's COVID-19 response. I've been leading data strategy for the COVID-19 Data Hub, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. That has really afforded me an opportunity to dig into so many different places, not just around the country, but also around the world. And I'm really excited to share some of those stories with you today, specifically those stories that pertain to the COVID-19 response in Hawaii. So thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. I'd like to direct the next, just a couple questions, simple question, I guess, I would say for Nick and Erin specifically. All of this talk about COVID-19 has really accelerated everyone's interest in data, but both of your organizations were already on this path of data culture, right? Transformation within your respective organizations. And just for our audience to help understand, was there any particular driver for change at your organization? What drove maybe that need for data analytics, decision-making, democratization of data, visualizations, whatever it might be? Like, sometimes it really helps for our audience to sort of understand, like, what was that tipping point? What was that moment? And then what we'll do from there is we'll jump into some of the COVID-19 response items. But maybe we can start with Erin, if you can let us know, what was that driver for change within your organization prior to COVID-19?
Right. I think actually, many of you may remember back in 2013, Hurricane Haiyan that really devastated the Philippines. And also when we take a look at the wildfires that have happened over the last several years out of California and the significant damage that's been caused by the hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and even here in Hawaii. It really has been the accumulation of all of these different events that led us to needing to change our approach and change our culture at the organization about data. We've always had a commitment to strong, reliable, credible data. And we've been identified by the Department of Defense Joint Staff as the official humanitarian assistance disaster relief data provider. But that doesn't always mean that you implement or are able to manage thousands of data sets that you can get at a click of a button and get that insight that I talked about. So it really has been I would say, the impacts of climate change and the impacts that climate change is having on the communities, and the decision makers need to have quick, really rapid access to data, which has shifted our mindset into making sure that real-time decisions, real-time data, combined with some of that risk and vulnerability context that they must have, is delivered to them seamlessly. And that behind the scenes, how that's happening is really fluid and agile, so that when new data sets come in, or new data or information, or new problem sets like COVID arise, that it's not disruptive to our process. So data is always important for disaster management. And as we see these changes, and we see the changes that they're having on our economic situation, our personal home situation, as well as our community, really was the driving force for the organization to advance these efforts.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. All right, Nick, how about you? What was the driving force for change?
Sure, yeah. So I think what's interesting is I'm coming at this from the perspective of data culture writ large in the state, which is, part of like what contextualizes the data cultures that we see in organizations like Aaron's and others. And actually, I'll tell a little bit of the history of why the Hawaii Data Collaborative exists in the first place, and why we think it should. We actually started off as a project, a research project at the Hawaii Leadership Forum. And what we were trying to do in that project was create an index of well-being for the state of Hawaii, something that spoke at the sub-county level to how communities are faring across domains of well-being, from economic opportunity to housing, health, et cetera. And so as that work moved forward, we, and we were doing that because we needed it to inform our work. And we also, many of our partners and stakeholders we were working with were saying the same thing, which is we really need kind of a coherent set of data to understand what's happening and what we should be doing about it, and to know what the result of what we're doing, is. Are we able to evaluate the impact of our programs? And so we moved forward on building that index of well-being, and Deena, we worked together on that, on some of the tools that resulted from that. In the process of doing that, we decided to go a little bit of a different direction from the index, but we learned a lot in the process. We found lots of data, but we found it in different places, different formats, different region schemes, and we were able to address that challenge in that availability of data. But we also saw significant gaps. When you start to think holistically about how to address some of the most pressing challenges for households and communities across the state, there were many domains that just were undermeasured or not measured at all. And so we started to think about how to do something about that. We also looked at the data we had and saw that there's kind of a disconnect between data collection for reporting requirements and data collection for driving decision-making and effective decision-making. And so in pulling together this index, or making a start on that, we got this crude sense of the data situation in Hawaii. And we started to ask ourselves a series of why questions about what we were seeing, and started to question whether or not we should keep pushing on getting a better index, or whether we should step back and say, okay, why are we seeing what we're seeing? Why, first of all, is it so hard to make important decisions in the state informed by data? Why do we have the data we have? Why don't we have the data we need? Why is the data that we do have in the state that it's in and in the places that it's in? And why isn't there more urgency for taking on some of these data challenges that we've found? With regards to data culture, my background is actually in organization development. So organization data culture is a concept that's comfortable to me. And when we talked about organization culture, we crudely defined it just as the way things are done in an organization. It's what's normal. And consequently deviating from what's normal is hard. It just kind of brings people along in a certain direction, in a certain orientation. And that comes from the various elements in the organization conspiring to shape that culture, which then shapes the attitudes, behaviors of individuals in that organization. And so, thinking about that conceptually, and then stepping back to say, okay, well, what if you want culture to be different? A fundamental axiom in organization change and culture change is you don't change the culture by trying to change the culture. Culture is the thing, but you don't change it by focusing on the thing. I think, and then consequentially from there, you look for opportunities to shape that culture or to shift that culture. And that often comes from significant change events or shocks to the organization system. So, fundamentally, culture change is hard, and it's not just something you can do. It's something you kind of take steps to shape. And significant shocks to the system are great opportunities to start to explore that and nudge that change you would want. And so I don't think it's hard to argue that societal data culture is of a similar flavor to that. It's of a similar nature. And what I would say is that COVID, it was that kind of aha moment, I think, for a lot of people around the data culture in Hawaii. It made the importance of accessible data so clear to so many. It was and continues to be the shared complex challenge. The implications of COVID, especially in the beginning, weren't clear. So there wasn't a clear, straightforward response. And we all kind of found ourselves with this shared responsibility to shape how we move forward through a shared understanding, which required shared data. I think we can all agree that the COVID data situation early on wasn't ideal, especially right out of the gate. And what I would say is that gave us kind of a window into the current data culture. What I'm excited about is, as far as I know, like, when have so many stakeholders, the public and key stakeholder decision makers, been so engaged around the data we have and how we use that data to shape how we move forward on a pressing challenge. So, as I turn it over to Jeremy, I challenge us all to envision this culture of data writ large in the state that's enhanced and sustained by the cultures of data that we're encouraging across our organizations.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And speaking of the use cases around effective response to COVID-19, I'm gonna stick with you, Nick, for a minute here. I'm just curious if there are any, maybe examples or use cases that you'd be able to share with us around how the communities come together around data and in its response to COVID. Are there any insights there that you wanted to further kind of elaborate on there?
Well, one thing I would say is that we've been very involved in working with the Department of Health. And so the epilogue to that story of kind of the data situation out of the gate is the Disease Outbreak Control Division and all of DOH has become really focused on how do we get the data we have out and engaging for those working on this challenge. And so one of those things was that recognition of that shared challenge that the public health, COVID's interesting, right? Because it naturally sits with public health, but there's this recognition that it's more than a public health challenge at this point. And so, that example I've seen is, okay, how do we start to think about the use cases more broadly? And once that's been embraced, we've seen a very different way of thinking about how to get the data out and shared, and starting to think long-term about, what would this look like going forward if we started to think more holistically about the role that public health data plays in all of the work that we do, helping people thrive in Hawaii.
All right, sounds great. Thank you, Nick. Erin, wanted to turn it to you and ask, like I mentioned earlier in the intro, you are in the Tableau COVID-19 Advisory Board, but there's a lot your world is about disasters and challenges. And so here we are in the middle of the pandemic. What are some use cases that you can share with us about how data really played a role in helping you guys, manage all of these items and the issues that new issues being faced?
Right. So it has been a distinct challenge for all of us during COVID, but when we combined a lot of these, so responding to a hurricane is challenging in itself. You need to notify people, you need to evacuate, you need to shelter, you need to deal with people that are injured. Now you add that layer on top of that of now you need to social distance. You can't put them in large, maybe sheltered areas like a school gym, or you need to disperse that. To be able to make the decisions to effectively protect the community, to say, okay, we will evacuate these areas, but we will evacuate you here. We can only do that if we have the data and information beforehand. Because when you have a major disaster, I can't stop and say, oh, we have a tsunami coming. Where are we now going to go? Where are our evacuation routes? What's safe? How are we going to still get to the hospital? All of that foundation, that foundational data that helps us to understand every community here in Hawaii, from the work that Nick's doing to the communities around the world, needs to be something that is done and committed to every single day. And that's what we've been doing since our inception. The last 20 years, we've been 25 now, really been trying to focus on the best data and information. And that was a result of Hurricane Iniki. So we came about because in Hurricane Iniki, the state and Senator Inouye said, hey, we do not have the same data and information that the Department of Defense has, or why aren't we using satellite imagery? Why don't we know? Why can't we make these decisions? So I think this idea of a culture shift and a focus to foundational data stretches for many, many years. The difference, though, that we've seen, I think, in the last 5 years is the advancement in technology that now makes data valuable. So I could have told you 5 years ago that I have thousands and thousands of data sets, and you might have found that very exciting. However, if you can't engage with the data in a way that's going to solve a problem or answer a question. And for me, for disaster management, I want to know what happened, where did it happen, how bad is it, and what do I need to do? And if I can answer those 4 questions, it takes more than 4 data layers. It actually takes, in some cases, hundreds of data layers and modeled outputs. But to be able to bring them all together to answer those critical decisions that are going to ultimately save lives and reduce losses. And I think we have an exceptional opportunity right now with COVID-19, and that people, the community, businesses, industries see the value in data. And honestly, when it's sunny outside and our beaches are full and everything is going well, data is not a very sexy topic. I'm going to be honest. Nobody really wants to talk about it. It doesn't seem really all that exciting. But now that you're stuck at home and you want to know, wait a sec, when can I have more than 5 people? When am I going to be able to? And wait, what does this rate mean? And what is the ICU rate? And people are starting to understand data more. They now want data, which allows us only to feed that or take advantage of that desire for knowledge if our data is presented in a transparent way, if it's done in a consistent way. And I loved what Nick said about being able to share open data. For very many years, data was seen as power, and I think we're moving past that, in that we're seeing data, well-structured data that can be brought together to provide insight, is the power that we want to give the people, is the power that we want to give to the communities, to the decision makers, because it advances all of us. And so, this COVID, very, very tragic, but I think is going to help in this culture shift that's going to help expand Hawaii, both the opportunities here in Hawaii and the protection of what makes Hawaii special. And so I hope that kind of answers your question there. Yeah,
I think so. And I guess even more tactically, if you're able to share, you have a broad scope, looking across the region, Asia Pacific. And when COVID-19 sort of first emerged and came out, were there any kind of specific activities where you leveraged, just to give our audience some inspiration on how they could leverage data to help them plan or manage assistance, or even as you look ahead into vaccine, if that plays a role for your organization, just different scenarios where you're starting to already have done that or are doing that now?
So I think some of the tactical things that our data team had put in place over the last couple of years of standardizing all of our data sets and automating using different technologies, GIS, FME, advanced analysis, to be able to bring data together is what has established us, has made it possible for us to be agile enough to continue our work despite being in different locations. So I think that in itself, having a policy at an organization that says we will commit to data standards and commit to authoritative data that is cleaned and processed, and nobody likes it but metadata. So that is something that you will not see a single data layer ever come from PDC without detailed metadata. And that allows people to use and leverage the data. So that, I think, tactically, having all data standardized in an easy to access, well-documented way is the first piece. But, we, over the last couple years, have been using Tableau for our global risk and vulnerability assessments. So also an index. We do a variety of indices, both at the global level and at subnational, similar to what Nick was discussing, but of course for disaster management. And what we've been able to do is transition our workflow really seamlessly to use Tableau to help support that. When COVID happened, we were then able to take those same workflows and adjust our exposure. So no longer were we looking at earthquakes or tsunamis. We could look at this global pandemic. And that simple change, having the foundation pre-established, that simple change meant that literally within hours, we were able to provide additional information, and now presented in a new way, whether that's the dashboards or new, infographics that we were putting out, and automate our process. And so if I had to say to any organization that was starting or really trying to focus on this, get a standard operating procedure for the standardization of data and ensure that that data is enterprise-wide. Because you're going to realize as you start to standardize this data, you're going to have so much data that questions you hadn't thought about asking because data wasn't available now become visible to you. And if you followed that process the whole way through, as new and emerging questions come up, you can quickly answer them.
Amazing. Great. All right. Well, Jeremy, I want to hear from you. I mean, you've got a broad reach, but you also have the connection, as you mentioned in your intro, to Hawaii. And I'd love to hear more about anything related to Tableau and the response, and how effective response is managed from maybe a Tableau perspective to the pandemic. So yeah, let me hand the mic to you. Love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. I mean, it's hard to believe that really almost a year has passed since Tableau, Salesforce, and other members of this family first mobilized to support, the public in their data-driven response to COVID. It was almost a year ago today that I was on my very last business trip. I was off to Seattle, and it was while I was there that COVID really began to emerge on the scene in the United States. While I was there, I got a phone call from a friend at UNICEF. At Tableau, I've supported the UN globally for a number of years, either directly or through my team. And this gentleman from UNICEF said, hey, listen, we know that children are going to be impacted socioeconomically by COVID, but we don't really know at this point to what extent. Can you help us, figure out that by crunching some survey data and building some visualizations so that way we can examine them, glean some insights from them, but also communicate, all of this to our stakeholders, which includes donors. We said, absolutely. And as we were working on that use case, we realized three things, many of which have already been discussed here. First, data was going to guide everything that followed, from creating stability as COVID really began to spread across the United States, to when it was safe, informing when organizations could get back into the workplace, to ultimately guiding how organizations were going to grow into what would eventually become, the new normal. The second thing we learned is that poor visualizations could lead to misinformation. You saw a number of visualizations emerge in these early days that, though they were trying to help, actually created a situation in which a lot of misinformation brewed. And then third, and Nick talked about this in particular, COVID data was really troublesome to work with. I mean, sure, a few organizations like, Johns Hopkins and the COVID Tracking Project and others were publishing their COVID-19 activity data, information on, positive cases and deaths and so on and so forth, to publicly accessible repositories, so that way all of us could make use of it to better understand the situation at hand. But leveraging that data proved to be either extremely time consuming or just difficult altogether because of structural issues, misspellings, these organizations were moving at the speed of light, and so on. At Tableau, our mission is to help people see and understand data. And so we got to work building what eventually became our flagship resource, the COVID-19 Data Hub. This is meant to be a resource that business leaders and the broader public can turn to for curated data streams that have been created to overcome some of those challenges that I just talked about previously, to allow the public to just keep track of how the pandemic was progressing day to day. And also, and I think this is the really important point, to help people appreciate the art of the possible. I think Aaron and the organization that you're a part of are extremely fortunate in that you had that strong foundation built on which you could rely as COVID really began to spread throughout the United States and the Pacific, but many organizations did not have that foundation. All at once, everybody realized that they needed to use data to do all sorts of stuff, but they didn't know what that looked like. And so we really carved out a big chunk of this resource to provide examples to help all of us just be more efficient in our collective data-driven response. I mean, fast forward today, and what an incredible journey it's been. Teammates from across, Salesforce, Tableau, MuleSoft, and others have, really given so much of themselves to do all sorts of things like protect 200 million people through contact tracing capabilities in work.com and help, different agencies manage vaccine scheduling, inventory, and, outcome monitorization through work.com for vaccines. And as it relates to Tableau specifically, inform, just about 230 million Americans about how COVID was specifically progressing in their communities. As it relates to Hawaii specifically, I have personally had the opportunity to work with, community leaders as well as the Department of Health and their COVID-19 response. Just to share one quick example, about 4 months ago, COVID was trending in the wrong direction on the Big Island, and a number of community leaders stepped up and said, hey, I want to help. Mass distribution was one community-led initiative. The goal was essentially to give each resident on the island 5 masks, so about 1 million masks overall. Now, first of all, it's not like the Big Island is a small place. Second of all, the risk of over-distributing to population centers like Hilo or Kona at the expense of these less densely populated areas is pretty high. And so we took a data-driven approach to sort through it. As masks were distributed, we did really simple stuff. We captured details on where those masks were going in Excel sheets and that kind of thing. From there, we brought all of this data into Tableau, and we started visualizing the hotspots, the communities that hadn't received their allocations. And day by day, those data points drove decisions. Data very much involved where the on-the-ground team was going to operate the following day and how this effort overall was tracking to goal. It's a really, really simple use case, but I love it because it highlights the impact that 100 simple rows in an Excel file can have.
I love that example too. Thanks, Jeremy. You know what I'd like to do before I have another question, but before I get to my very last question, because I want to make sure there's time at the end as well, but I would like to ask just kind of an open-ended question for all 3 of you. You've got, visibility to Hawaii. You have a very strong connection, all 3 of you, to Hawaii. Are there any other challenges that you see Hawaii being able to potentially address by leveraging data? especially as we look ahead. So I'll open the floor in a little bit of a creative mode here if there are challenges that you could see Hawaii addressing with data.
So I wanted to jump in on this, and actually was going to build off of what Aaron and Jeremy were talking about, that you know, this concept of democratizing data, and you know, the sense that it's not enough just to make the data available. So it's really interesting, because it's like, I feel like it's like we all agree now we need more data, and then we're taking 2 steps further, but that's not enough, right? And so the way we talk about it at the collaborative is like, if you talk about data accessibility, making it available is only one criteria for accessibility. The second is making it usable, right? So some of the strategies you see for data sharing now are either you know, data sets that it's hard to even know where to start with it. So maybe it's machine readable, but the metadata, like Aaron talked about, isn't enough for somebody to really grab that data set and run with it. Or what's more common that we see in the state is the data is actually prepackaged in a report or something like that. So a lot of the data that we find and work with, we've gotten really good at scraping PDF files for data, because that's where a lot of the rich data is. And it's actually data that can be used for so many different things, but it's packaged in such a way that it's not very flexible. So there's a little bit of a transparency in how data is being interpreted, but the opportunities with like Tableau and other visualizations and things like that is kind of opening up the meaning-making process for broader consumption. So the data's there, it's useful, and how the meaning is being made is opened up to a broader community. And that's another like multi-stakeholder phenomenon that we saw with COVID data, is there was meaning making around how should we close down, how should we close down, how long should we be closed down, all those things like that, that needed transparency around case numbers and curves and flattening the curve, if everybody remembers those kinds of things. And now we're doing the same thing in terms of what's a reasonable timeline for vaccination, such that people's behaviors can start to open up to what used to be normal. Things like that. I think it's not just now enough for agencies and others that have data and are putting data out there to put it out there, but to make their meaning discovery process more transparent, and also to think about, okay, others are going to need to make their own meaning. How can we support that in a robust way?
Love it.
Yeah, if I can just add on to that, Nick, you know, part of what we say at PDC is that we're the bridge, right? We look at ourselves as the bridge between the academic community, the geologists, the meteorologists, the seismologists, and the decision makers, the emergency managers, the state officials, the local officials that need to make decisions. And, you know, both of these two groups operate at a different level or comfort level with uncertainty. The academic community does not want to release data until, you know, it has the 95% confidence interval and it's peer reviewed and it's all of these things. And the community leaders will and must make a decision. The deputy commander of Indo-PACOM said to me one time, I'm going to make a decision if I have 80% of the information, 10%, or none, because I have to. So how do I speed that up? And I think as we look forward, that's what we need to do. And to do that, we have to make sure that the visualization and the communication of this data is one that is ingestible and digestible, one that decision makers can feel confident in, so that they know, one, you know, Nick's organization has provided the data and we know that that is credible data and information. And then, you know, we're pairing it with software like Tableau, and the output of it is meaningful because it's simple and action oriented. And I think that is the second, third, fourth step, you know, to getting us to the insight, to the decision, because ultimately that's what we want. There are only a handful of us that are really science nerds, I guess, or really want to know every single thing about the data, but the majority of the population wants to know the output, and it's best delivered in simple, easy to understand graphics with action associated with it. And so I think that's where we're going to be going, and not just for COVID-19, but for reopening of communities, for advancement and changes in our economic development here in Hawaii. I mean, this has had significant changes. We can't say that it hasn't. For school children, when are schools opening? How are we dealing? So all of these issues that we're dealing with right now as a result of COVID are going to shift over the next 1 to 5 years. And we're going to need the data presented in a way that we know it's authoritative and action oriented. And so I think that's what all of our organizations, each of us have a little niche, you know, that we have a specific area, but the foundation of that data applies to every single group. And I think that's what the key is. And I'm excited to be part of that culture that continues to push it here in Hawaii.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add in just listening to Nick and then Aaron's response, I mean, I really talk about two things when I say what's required to thrive in a data era. It's not just data, it's not just investments in technology, it's really two things beyond that, and that's culture and capabilities. Data culture, I mean, it's all about creating, you know, the right environment where, you know, people are free to ask the hard questions and challenge ideas, where people can, you know, come together with a shared mission to improve the organization and themselves with data, where leaders, you know, inspire through action, basing decisions, you know, on data and not intuition. And over the past 4 months, I think all of us have seen firsthand the evolution of, you know, a number of organizations within Hawaii, their data culture increasingly sharing data cross-functionally and to the public more broadly to support our overall or our collective COVID-19 response. Culture is king, but it's insufficient in and of itself. You need to also build capabilities to become more data-driven. And by capabilities, I mean the process stuff, you know, a tech stack that's super agile, something that can respond as organizational needs respond or evolve. Analytics proficiency amongst the public and users of these tech stacks, a vibrant community to inspire and celebrate data-driven wins within the organization, and then governance across both data and then content as well. It really has been a pleasure working with, you know, different elements within the Department of Health and other community leaders across the Big Island over the past few months on building capabilities, specifically in the areas of data visualization, helping them appreciate, you know, the how and the why behind color choice, and helping people think through the art of the possible with Tableau and more. I'll leave a couple of resources in the chat that really speak to how we view those two different components, the data culture side and then the capability side.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeremy. Cool. Well, I'm going to come down to my last question for you guys. And that really is, I think, Jeremy, actually, what you just said was the perfect segue into this, because it really is that recap. I know we're really taking a data culture topic today and really thinking about what does that mean at your organization. And I want to pose it that way and that question to everyone. You know, what does data culture really mean? And I think you've answered part of that, Jeremy, today in your last response, and also sort of where you see things going organizationally. And maybe Jeremy, your response is a bit more broad, but like, where do you see things going as far as this data culture concept, and how do you see it evolving as you look ahead?
Yeah, for me, I just see it as becoming something that individuals can no longer avoid. I mean, like Aaron and Nick both said, when COVID first kicked off, we were all asked to do our part to help flatten the curve. But what did the curve look like in any given moment? Well, that was, you know, a question that could only be asked or answered rather through the use of data. So from the earliest days of the pandemic, everybody collectively became a data interested person. Now we're extending that back to our organizations. So not just our personal lives, but also our professional lives. How do we build on all of that and go forward in the right direction? I think that begins with building a data culture.
Awesome. Aaron, your thoughts?
I will say that I think it's interesting that a lot of people who start to enter the world of decision making through data tend to think that data is going to provide a whole new direction for the organization. And in reality, the analysis, if you're embedded in the field extensively and you've been working in the field extensively, whatever that field may be, the data in most cases will probably validate some of the assumptions that you have, and then open the aperture and kind of guide you to look at new things. It might not be oh no, we have to take a whole right turn. And I always go back several years ago, we were doing an analysis for a risk and vulnerability assessment for Africa. And, we ran the assessment, we had some really great results. We were presenting it to a panel who had spent their careers, 20, 30 years on the continent. And they said to us, well, we don't really agree with the assessment because you're not telling me anything new. And, with all due respect to everybody there, we said to them that, well, I've never set foot there. I don't know anything about that. And yet I came up with the same output that you spent 20 years guiding. So what you've done is actually validate our data, validate the output, validate the research. And so I think that is important for integrating perhaps in your organization individuals who are data reluctant or reluctant to embrace data because they trust their gut, they trust their experiences, and they trust, their feelings. By having them say to you, you're not telling me anything new, we're saying exactly. And this is why it's so important, because as we bring the next generation, they're not going to have the knowledge that you had. And so we want to really make it transparent and open. So I think that that's a good guiding point as we move forward, and one that I want to continue to embrace and open.
Awesome. Sounds good. Nick?
Yeah, just such rich comments from Jeremy and Aaron. And I just want to kind of build off it a little bit. We've been thinking about how to do this writ large in Hawaii along 6 factors. And they fit really neatly into how Jeremy kind of described. There's the capacity side and the culture side. So it's easy to rattle off the capacity side stuff around sufficiency of data systems and processes in government, timeliness of data flows, and breadth of data points. So 1, 2, 3 on the capacity side. And the richness of this conversation is on that culture side. And I love this idea of data reluctant folks, because you encounter that so much that people are actually they oftentimes can be either data competent or data aware, and they're just not sold based on what the current system allows for doing and how data is adopted into decision-making processes. So those other 3 factors in how we've been thinking about it is around what are the forums for feedback, data engagement, and data communication. So those that have the data, those that are sharing the data, holding the data, interpreting the data, those being measured. What are the platforms where that comes together in constructive ways? What's the trust in the network? What sets up for success the ability for somebody who has data to share it and trust that next step in the data process is going to go well for them? Because that's a common reluctancy in state agencies, is they actually would love their data to be used more productively, but their experience is often that it's not. It actually makes it harder for them to do their work, or it leaves them in a position of vulnerability because of the data capacity side issues. And then on the reluctance around data-driven decision-making, there's not a lot of trust in the data system being sufficient to be robust in using data to drive those decisions. And so it's kind of a chicken and egg kind of phenomena that we're in. 1, and 2, there's kind of this in Hawaii, we've kind of noticed that there's a tendency to sell the decision and then get down to the details later. And so a lot of times we find ourselves invited into decision-making processes after a good amount of the meat of the decision has already come together and been made. And so then it's about how does the data come alongside to support that decision made. And we always want to say, well, let's take a couple steps back. Let's kind of do some things to validate that decision or test some of the fundamental assumptions that go into that. And that will start to happen when there's a more robust data capacity there to do that, and people start to expect it from decision makers.
Great, thank you so much. Got a couple questions. We're going to transition to our Q&A time frame. We're looking good on time. So I've got a question here that someone submitted. What do you recommend to break down data silos and encourage upper management in data culture? I'll leave it as an open one because I feel like a lot of you could share some insights on this one.
I'm happy to start on that one because we have 3 very large teams that all had their own way of collecting data, and they were sure it was the right way, and they wanted to use it in different formats. And so we really sold them on allowing somebody to create the foundation that you could then pull data in and do your analysis. So, you know, the IT group might be looking at different decisions than the operations group, then perhaps the applied science. But to do that, to get them to that point, we started having people share the output of analysis. And in some cases with known holes in it. And they would say, well, that's not a complete analysis because it doesn't have this, this, and this. And we'd say, well, where's that data? Oh, well, that sits over here. Okay, so let's open that up. Let's bring it over. So providing really an environment where they can see how their contributions can change the output. And it takes a lot of work. I'm not going to say it doesn't. It has to be in really active type engagement to break down those walls. But now we have an enterprise-wide data solution. And I think it's taken us several years to get there, but it is really worth the time and effort to do that.
Cool. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
Yeah, just to chime in Tableau's parlance, we call this community. Bringing people together on some sort of routine basis to talk through data wins, data struggles, and more. Really, there's a lot of, I mean, as Aaron shared here, there's a lot of cross-learning that can come from that. As organizations are just getting started in their data journey, this is one of the first things that we always recommend they do. Yes, figure out how you're going to deploy your tech stack. Yes, you know, figure out how you're going to teach people on how to use that tech stack. But most importantly, schedule out some time every month to bring together your users, whether it's virtually or in person, to talk through what it is that they're, you know, succeeding with as they go on that journey and what it is that they're struggling with in that journey, all in the interest of mutual learning. That's the kind of stuff, though it's more about capabilities, that's the kind of stuff that helps to drive this idea of data culture in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Nick, did you want to add or move on to the next one? I'm good. Okay. So I've got another question here. How do we use data to assist policymakers on vaccine status and testing processes for COVID in order to promote safe reopening of businesses in Hawaii? And there's a little comment here. I got to read it. P.S. I'm a former military user of PDC's data and a major fan. So I got some Aaron props there.
Thank you, Admiral, for putting that former command surgeon over there. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I think right now, one of the ways that we're working both with the military is, and with the state, is providing information on where our most vulnerable populations, cross-referencing that with where our hotspots are, and understanding culturally, specifically for Hawaii, culturally what is driving the clusters or where we're seeing this uptick, like Maui, for example, where I'm at, you know, understanding that. So it's bringing together not just the data points, but also the cultural understanding so that you can make culturally appropriate investments so that we can get the country moving forward, or the state and the communities moving forward. The other point is just having the point data. Where are the vaccines? Where are our distribution centers? What are our logistics routes? The tactical elements, I've been surprised, are not always well brought together, documented, and displayed. And so that's something that we are working on, not just here in Hawaii, but also for the territories out in the Pacific.
Awesome, cool. Any other comments?
Just from the Hawaii specific vaccination rollout, I've come to learn like the challenges and nuances of, how to communicate the vaccination situation. It's been very interesting. Like the purposes of the communication would be like writ large, helping people understand where are we in terms of progress towards a goal. So it's very dashboard like, right? Which is, we all want to know, when do we hit that magic, whatever, 70% number or something like that. And then of course the steps along the way, which is the vaccination plan, 1A, 1B, 1C, et cetera, phase 2. And helping people understand that, and also kind of see and have some transparencies around where it's been harder to reach populations and get those populations vaccinated, and where we're on track, something like that. And then the other side, as Aaron pointed out, is the logistics, and how do you communicate the logistics challenges? I mean, we haven't exactly had top-notch leadership at the federal level around vaccination rollout, and so there's so many moving pieces. It's very fluid, it's changing, all those kinds of things. How do you help the public understand where the bottlenecks are, where the hangups are, where the logistical challenges are, and to be able to see where that's getting better and where it's not, because then they can be more engaged and more informed as they start to reach out to policymakers and others with their concerns.
Great. All right. Well, there's a few minutes left. I feel like we should turn it over to Michelle. By the way, the panelists, thank you so much for your time. It was incredibly valuable and interesting. Yeah, I'm very impressed with each one of you. So thank you so much for taking the time. Michelle, back to you.